Hey, good evening. Welcome to A Foreigner in the Philippines. Well, you will have seen, I suspect you'll have seen the video that we met our visitors, and that was Harry and Mer, and it was interesting to find out that Harry had been in the service. I think it was the Army, the Canadian service, for some 32 years, a mind-numbing number of years. There was me thinking that I was hard done to when I was in the Army for 8.5 years. The thing about my service was that it, in many ways, it helped me to, it kind of revealed my character, which is one which just doesn't sit very well with authority, and for someone who doesn't get along with authority, the Army is a very, very difficult place to be, right? So this is the problem when you're in the Army, and nobody seems to understand this, and that is that you have people who really are refugees from life. There's always this very powerful, especially in the States, in the US, that there's always the army of one, and then they have various movies where the scenario is that the Marine has come back from 2 or 3 tours of duty, is skilled in martial arts, skilled in weapons, is no-nonsense, laconic, doesn't speak very much, and anybody gets in his way, he suddenly explodes into this incredible moving dynamo, like a cross between, I don't know, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Bruce Lee. Now he just sorts everybody out, and he does it without losing his temper, and it all seems so incredibly admirable, doesn't it? And yet, when I was in the Army, it just looked like a load of idiots telling you what to do. When you're in the British Army, I've been through this before and told it before, but it's such a... when I meet anybody that's been in the Army for a great number of years, it brings it all back to me. It's all seething and not very far under the surface. And I remember being in the Army where they are held to rules which make very, very little sense. They give you uniforms which, in the British, we're talking about the British Army now, the American Army always seemed to me to be a lot more sensible, because whenever you saw them on a Hollywood stage, when I say that I mean in a movie, they had no time for officers, and officers were just commonplace people like they were. Everybody spoke with an American accent, whereas in the British Army everybody doesn't speak with the same accent, because in order to be an officer you have to speak, we used to joke and say you have to speak as if you got a plum in your mouth. Oh, sorry, you there, go over and do this, and do it very quickly, okay? They didn't say okay, they said oh, okay. Reminds me of when I thought that's what you had to do. Back in the day, if you spoke with what is now known as a provincial accent, which is pretty much how I speak, this was something that was never going to get you anywhere. So it was fashionable to take elocution lessons. They called them elocution lessons, and I remember going to see a wonderful lady, and she lived in Knightsbridge, which was awfully a posh place to be. And I remember going there, and she would take me through the vowels, and I would be going A, O, U, and so on. And I actually thought that I could do it, but I was in a band at the time that was on the road, and just the thought that I was going to suddenly start talking instead of talking, and say ew instead of oh, and the thought that I was going to do that. What are you doing, puss? The thought that I was going to do that and do it without being laughed off the stage was almost impossible for me. So when we got to the part where my teacher, my coach, would tell me, excuse me, I'm not in the way here, am I? No, she's gone. Okay. So when my teacher was teaching me how to say oh, and I was supposed to say oh, you see the difference in the mouth between saying oh and oh. Oh. So I would, in my natural accent, I would say oh yes, oh yeah, oh yes, whereas she would expect me to say oh yes. I could not imagine it. I was thinking of myself, thinking forward to when I'd arrived at the gig with the rest of the guys in the band, none of whom said the word ew, and going to the bar and having a Coke because I was a non-drinker, and somebody saying to me, so how was your day? Was it good? And I say, oh yes, it was wonderful. And they would go, excuse me, what? You what? What? Is it you, Terence? I couldn't do it. And so when my coach said, no, it's oh, Terence, say oh, not oh, I had to say to her, I can't do it. And that was the end of the lesson. It was the end of the lesson. It was the end of the lessons. It was the end of my striving to be an uncomfortable part of the upper class. Now, in the army, anybody who's an officer can't be an officer unless they can say, oh yes, private, oh yes, I saw you. They couldn't actually be an officer. A friend of mine who had admirable leadership skills, was very intelligent, was well educated, and had been, for the latter part of his education, had been to one of the military schools that his father, who was a sergeant major in the service for something like 22 years, and had reached the non-commissioned officer stage, which is sergeant major, was allowed to claim a place for his son in the military school. And my friend took to it very, very well. He ended up in the band that I was in the army because they had agreed that they would let him out of his service, because they had promised him that he would be an officer, and on all of his qualifications he was well equipped to be an officer, except he couldn't say ew. He was from Brum, and he didn't speak like an officer. And his father owned and ran a fish and chip shop. Now, when he went to the officer training school, where everybody else said ew, and he said oh, and they finally pulled him in and said, Robert, we're terribly sorry. Oh, we are terribly sorry, but we have to fail you. You have to be failed. You can't be an officer. And my friend Robert said, oh, why is that? And they said, well, evidently you can't say the word oh, and your father runs a fish and chip shop, and sorry, but you won't be accepted in the mess, because everybody else will be saying, oh, and you'll be saying, oh, what, you what? It won't work, Robert. So, he had played in his childhood, he had played the clarinet a little bit, enough to be a failed clarinetist, and they sent him to the band that I was in just to serve out a few months of his time until they could work out a way in which he would be discharged honourably. And so he was. And then he went on to be a very successful executive of a big company, and probably still is right now, because they can't bear to let him go. He's just too good at his job. So that's the setup in the army. You can't be an officer unless you can say the word oh, oh, oh no, 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 no. So I quickly realized that this was the army's Achilles heel. What the army does, the British Army, is, and when I was in the army, it was quite archaic. You could be charged, now people don't believe this, but you could be charged for the way that you looked at an officer. Imagine, they would have a charge, I think it was called dumb insolence. And the way that you looked could land you on a charge, being punished for that. Yes, it was the way he looked at me. And the officer taking the charge would say, oh no, really? So, after I realized that, well, after 1 year, for 1 year, I went along thinking, well, it's going to get better. It will get better. It has to get better. And then after a year, I realized it wasn't going to get better. It was as bad and as good as it ever would be. And I realized it would have to be a change of strategy, because up to that point I'd worked very hard at making everything about the uniform, which was a mess, into something that I could wear with pride, so that I didn't feel stupid. Now, I've described this once before, when you go to the quartermaster store and you are being issued with your uniform, when you tell them the size, they don't care a hoot what the size is, and they throw you whatever comes about. So you go in there and you fit a pair of size 8 trousers, they'll quite happily throw you a size 10. And if you say, but sir, this is too big for me, you say, that's why we have tailors, sonny. Take it to the tailors. And then the tailor would have to try to make something of it. It was insane in my estimation. Well, for a number of years, I struggled along with this. They would issue you with a beret, and the beret would be as big as a very large serving plate. So we're looking at a beret that was like this big. Now, there are techniques that the old soldiers will show you where you can shrink it down using boiling water, and you can shrink it down so that it looks like something that John Wayne would wear, you see, and it would only be this big, and it wouldn't be holding the sun off your shoulders. Well, here's the irony. You can be charged for doing that because it's defacing government property. So in doing what is expected of you, you are playing into the hands of any idiot with a stripe and a rank who wants to make your life very difficult. So there is a way round. Instead of paying your own money to have your uniform tailored, instead of spending your own time shrinking your beret down to John Wayne size, you don't do that. Now, why would they not suspect that you were doing something to be bloody-minded? It never occurs to them that someone would rebel in this way. So, I went and sat a couple of times through some of the Jerry Lewis films where he was in the army and he was exceptionally good at his job. I remember Dean Martin coming in and he was having his new friend that he was being asked to chaperone, which was Jerry Lewis, and he was being told that the film was called Sad Sack, I think, and Jerry Lewis was a brilliant, but he was a brilliant idiot. Like he couldn't do anything wrong, and yet he couldn't do it right. So they said, well, why? And I guess Dean Martin was trying to understand this, if I remember the scene right, and it was explained to him. Well, he camouflaged a tank, and Dean Martin says, what's wrong with that? Says, well, they haven't been able to find it since he camouflaged it. Apparently, he did things so incredibly well that he was beyond reproach, but he was completely useless to them. And it was after that that I read a book called The Private War, and I think it was The Private War of, if anybody knows this book, I would love to read it again. It was about a private in the German army, and this man in the German army, he was, as I say, he was a private. I think it was Private Smith or Private Scheiskopf or something like that. He decided that he would use the rules and regulations of the army to protect himself, and so he learned them. I thought, well, that's a brilliant thing to do. And so I actually learned some of the rules and regulations, and if I was being given a difficult time, I would say, well, that's against Queen's rules and regulations, that I'm not allowed to do that. And very quickly I became what was called a barrack room lawyer. That's what they would call someone who was, what can we say, was intelligent enough to fight back in a different way. Well, that didn't get me very far, so I had to leave that one aside and stop doing that, because the catch-22 is that in the same way that they have rules and regulations which would protect you from unreasonable punishment or behaviour on the part of non-commissioned officers, it was against Queen's rules and regulations to quote them. So a private was not allowed to quote rules and regulations. So you can't do it. Your hands are tied in every way. But not in every way. I realized that the emphasis was on giving you mission impossible. Here's your uniform, and even though it's 2 sizes too big, you've got to make it look right. And boy, people would sweat blood on doing just that. And if you've ever seen any movies about the army, you'll know this will be familiar. So what I did was I stopped trying, and this drove them insane. Now, why would I do that and make it difficult on myself? I felt that I was looking at the way that when people went into the army and they gave in to the system, it was like they lost a little bit up there and began thinking in a totally different way. So I thought, I can't have that. So even at a very early age, I started to fight that. And the way that I fought it was, if I went to get some portion of my uniform, and I knew that a pair of size 8 pants were just the right fit for me, I would ask for it, and knowing that if I asked for 8s they would give me 10s, I would ask for 10s and they would give me 12s. Then I would take those trousers to the tailor and I would say, these trousers are too long for me, and he would take about a foot off the bottom of the pants, which then left the crotch of the pants somewhere down mid-thighs, and in some of the worst cases close to my knees for the clutch. So there was no way that I could ever look what they call smart. I used to make sure that everything that I wore was clean and up to the cleanliness, and it's actually, in the army it's called bullshit, excuse that, but you have to reach the bullshit mark, which is a different way of using that word in the army. It means that you have gone to every length to press the creases in your trousers extra sharp, and to have the brasses on your belt extra polished, and all of that. Well, I made sure that the creases were all there. I made sure that all of that was there. I made sure that the brasses were clean, and I made sure that I had certainly not shrunk my beret down to John Wayne. No, I had left mine gloriously big in the style of Jerry Lewis. He was my mentor, my silent mentor, and my idol. And that's how I did it. At that time, I loved the idea because I was into jazz and everything was super cool. You know what you like when you're a kid? And I loved playing the trombone, and I used to have horn-rimmed glasses. That was the cool thing. You know, a lot of people who were jazzers, they had horn-rimmed glasses and they were super cool. They were big like this. So I had a pair of horn-rimmed glasses and they were big, and I would wear those. I would also wear my super unshrunk, un-John Wayne beret, which was like a pancake and keeping the rain off my shoulders, and I would pull it down over my eyebrows, just over my horn-rimmed glasses, and down over my ears so that my ears bent out like this, and that's how I would go on parade. But everything would be immaculate, and the crowning glory of my campaign against the army to make the army stupid by making myself look stupid and not caring because it was the army. I didn't look that way when I went out in my civilian clothes, but I did when I wore the army's, and I couldn't be penalised because they couldn't grasp the idea that anybody would want to look like that deliberately. And on parade I went, and the sergeant, the colour sergeant, who was in charge of the particular band that I was in then, I was in several different bands, he looked at me and he despaired, as if almost close to tears. He said, "Flannery, I can't understand it. All your gear is clean, there's nothing wrong, it's all clean, but you look like a sack of shit." Pardon my language. And as I skipped away, doing the old clicking the heels, like as if I was singing in the rain, I said, "Thank you." There are different ways to rebel against the system, and that was one. Bye for now.